going to talk about nostalgia and criticism for the post-war Baltic modernism. And you can see that I use the picture again of the similar form of Jūras Perle summer cafe on the Baltic Sea that was built in '65. But this one hasn't survived, unfortunately. But it gives us probably an inspiration to think about the forms and ideas that were predominant in the 60s. And in the presentation, I want to show how these forms of modernism in the 60s started to be appropriated and somehow started to be owned, how ownership was claimed, showing that probably is it Baltic modernism or is it international modernism or is it just Soviet modernism. And when in 2016, it's last year, World Heritage Committee inscribed the works of Le Corbusier on the World Heritage List, it must have been the moment of triumph for many lovers of modern movement and people who initiated preservation programs for modern architecture. With key works of Mies, Gropius and other masters of modern movement, Aalto on the way, as I understood, we can be sure that modern movement became the established cultural heritage. But how about the socialist modernism? It already had its momentum with a few years ago with lectures, books, conferences, exhibitions. And these efforts testify somehow to the need to understand and consider it. However, the question is also, we can raise the question, does socialist modernism really fit into the general discourse of modernism, or is it something special? Does it need some different criteria for evaluation? Why doesn't it apply for World Heritage, for UNESCO heritage? And maybe a good provocation could be the Polish researchers, Kuba Snopek, book Belayevo Forever, who tried to put a Moscow mass housing area, Belayevo, on the UNESCO World Heritage List, but with the discussion of the values of generic architecture. How can we evaluate this kind of architecture? On the other hand, isn't it too simplified view to the socialist modernism heritage? Isn't too symptomatic that everything that socialist modernism can offer to the world community is mass housing, these large housing estates? But maybe post-socialist world simply does not love socialist modernism at all, not interested in preserving it. And this alarming example from Skopje also can be an illustration, because this Macedonia's capital was rebuilt after the '63 earthquake with a modernist center planned by Japanese architect Kenzo Tange. And now it's being refurbished, antiquated, and the center is transformed. Asked why, the Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski told that, I'm quoting, national feelings were suppressed in Tito's Yugoslavia, and there were no monuments or statues to express our nationhood. So doesn't it suggest that socialist period is not worth preserving, since it did not produce anything valuable for the nationhood? So it's quite paradoxical that even if we look at socialist modernism and socialist realism, when we compare, people are now express more favorite approach to socialist realism because of its forms, elaborate decoration, not associating with much difficult historical legacy instead of socialist modernism, which probably doesn't have such difficult past, but it presents forms that are too common, which age not beautifully, and for the socialist world, it reminds of this mass housing and many buildings that were built during the course of 50 years. So in general, I would see three problems of post-war modernism. It's ideological, it's aesthetical, and it's technological. And in the following presentation, I would like to see how these three problems that are probably general for all post-war modernism can be specified in the post-Soviet context and in the post-Soviet Baltic countries. Here you can see the picture from the 2013 Tallinn Architectural Biennale, which was dedicated to the questions of recycling modernism, meaning can we do something with this? Or do we need to do something with it? So talking about ideological problems, I would draw to two waves of revisionism that are very important in understanding it, because the first wave of revisionism that was just after the Berlin Wall was broken and the collapse of USSR, it seems that it was rather clear what monuments are to get rid of, and others that were seen not as ideologically harmful were left in a latent positions. And you can even see that in Lithuania we had almost 50 monuments of the period of post-war and the socialist modernism were listed, and in this historical revision, it was somehow reconciliation made that, okay, it is already history, we have to take from the history certain monuments, architectural objects that we could list that tell our history. However, the second wave of revisionism that can be started from the bronze soldier case in Tallinn, when the bronze soldier dedicated for the Second World War, and the Red Army was removed from the city center to the military cemetery. It, of course, raised a big debate and even rages in the city, but this difficult decision in a way helped to Estonia to resolve this problem, not to be raised again. However, after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the things that seemed in history, that seemed being history, were risen again in a very sensitive way. And you can see that, for example, in Lithuania, even those monuments that were left or were seen before as unharmful or historical or allegorical, not bearing direct symbols, were reconsidered again. And especially this case of the Green Bridge is important because it was heavily debated in society. But you can see that it was listed in 2006. When it was seen as history, without ideological load. And in 2014, it started to be debated again because one of the group of sculptures among farmers, workers, and intelligentsia were soldiers. And it was Red Army soldiers. So it was removed for restoration, first, of this bridge, and then it was delisted. Of course, there were debates, and there was contemporary art proposals made, which I think was one of these, the Stalinization of the bridge, was a very powerful one because the statues were left on the side, but put in the cages, somehow expressing the attitude of the society to these monuments. However, in 2015, during the night, these sculptures were removed. And now we can raise several questions. How this ideological revisionism, the second wave of revisionism, affect modernist architecture. And we can see that it changes the relatively favorable discourse of the national post-war modernism in Lithuania, because before that it really enjoyed the status of being inner abroad or Soviet West that was created during the Soviet period. And many citations were used describing this architecture that Baltic republics actively contributed to the transformation of the aesthetic milieu of Soviet everyday life and to formation of the new style. So they were self-perceived as mediators of Western modernism in the Soviet Union. An illustrative example is the cover of the famous Architecture de Jordi, dedicated to Soviet architecture in '69. This is the personal copy of one of the most famous Lithuanian 60s modernist, Vytautas Čekanauskas, and you can, in more precise view, you can see that 3 flags are crossed here. That's being Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in a way showing or indicated that we are not Sovietic. So some other identity is proposed by architects themselves or by this group of influential modernists of the 60s. And what is their narrative or what are their arguments in claiming that? First of all, this symbolic relocation in time and taking inspiration from interwar modernisms that were creating during the interwar period in all 3 Baltic republics, national modernisms that was perceived as the golden age of national architecture. And you can see also that first buildings in the early 60s were really very connected to that pre-war school, although it was dismantled during the Second World War and post-war years. Also, the very strong orientation towards the West was emphasized in all interviews with architects, that they were getting access in any form to Western magazines, Western architectural journals, getting all information possible, not to look at the Soviet or Russian modernist architecture, but to look on to the West. A very strong argument was always this experienced West and the Finnish influence, starting from the first study trips to Finland organized by the Union of Architects, and they claim that their national modernism in the 60s was actually the interpretation of the Nordic regionalism, Aalto in particular. How was it done? With local materials, with small scales, with human scale architecture, with very good landscaping or putting in the landscape. And in the beginning, it was done, of course, in the interiors, in the small size buildings, but later, in the mid-60s, already in the national highlights buildings like Song Festival Arena in Tallinn, Art Exhibition Palace in Vilnius, or Dailės Theatre in Riga. Similarly, proud architects were of their achievements in mass housing architecture in the Baltic states, claiming that it was very different from the rest of the Soviet Union, because a lot of architectural attention and Finnish influence again, like Tapiola and Vällingby were mentioned most often. And architects were really proud of their awards, especially the first and only Lenin Prize for the Lazdynai mass housing residential district in '74, and you can see that it's the real photograph from their archives. They are still proud of this evaluation. And also they claim that the design of kolkhoz settlements were also exceptional in the Baltic countries because of a very strong touch of design and architecture, and because that Baltic agricultural economy was very advanced in comparison with other Soviet republics. Although collectivization was perceived as absolutely negatively, but the achievements in kolkhoz settlement planning was presented as very good architecture, especially in Estonia. One more argument was that Baltic architects were always critical to Soviet architecture or to Soviet modernism, and probably the culmination of it was the Tallinn School in the 70s, which criticized Soviet modernism with postmodern designs, although it was mostly the paper architecture. But later, all these critical architects became established Estonian architects, mostly in kolkhoz settlement design. So it was also an interesting point. So, what actually are they longing today? The positive self-representation of modernist architects present that they all talk about the cultural resistance during the Soviet period, and that they were in charge to creating of national modernism with this Western orientation. And the powerful thing also testifies that their achievements, their designs, and they were so influenced that their designs were already listed in 84 and 85. And if we look more precisely to the fact about socialist modernism, which is on the National Heritage List, most of all these buildings were listed actually not in the independent state, but still in the Soviet Lithuanian Republic. So it's quite a paradox that most of these buildings are still on the list because of the achievements of this group themselves. And it's actually an urban legend that Lithuanian architects like telling about their silent resistance or cultural resistance to Soviet regime. And repeating it again and again, they really uphold the myth of exclusivity of the architecture of the Baltic states. And we can see at it from it's double-ended, because on one hand it's very beneficial to get preservation for socialist modernism, because it has positive appropriation in the society, because it's ours, it's not imposed. On the other hand, after the second wave of revisionism, new questions were started to be held. For example, bad origin. They usually emphasize the aesthetical side of the building, but never tell what was the origin, if they designed the Communist Party committee building or some other very socialist or related to Communist Party building. Also, they are claimed alike servants to their own ambitions and Soviet government, and not being a cultural resistance at all, because their buildings couldn't be implemented without the state power. So how could they be dissidents or resistance if they used Soviet power to implement their buildings? Also, the more general negative comment is that there cannot be any good things produced in the Soviet regime if the regime itself was bad. So it's quite paradoxical now that these architects became more theoreticians when they lost their power as architects, and they lost their very important status in society, and they are being most nostalgic for their lost status in society. But to show some contradictional cases, I have selected how these bad origin things are now used in the Baltic society. Of course, this is an exceptional case of Neringa Cafe, the highlight of national modernism, the first one in '59, which was already put on the list in the '80s, and that helped to preserve it up till now. But if we look to the buildings with bad origin, let's say, like Communist Party Central Committee headquarters in Riga, it's pretty well restored and used now as a World Trade Center. Also, the Communist Party Central Committee headquarters in Vilnius is, without any bad memories, is used now as a Lithuanian government building. The Communist Party Central Committee headquarters in Tallinn are used like Ministry of Foreign Affairs now. House of Political Education in Riga is now holding Riga Congress Center. House of Political Education in Kaunas is now the university. House of Political Education in Vilnius is now a concert hall. And Dailės Theatre in Riga is used as a theatre, as well as the Opera and Ballet Theatre in Vilnius. And one of the important renovations is the former Revolution Museum in Vilnius, which was converted to the National Gallery of Art in 2009. Some ideological museums also were converted to the contemporary museums, like, for example, the Red Latvian Rifleman Museum and Monument, into the Museum of Occupation of Latvia. Some buildings also are not perceived as imposing new Soviet way of life, but for example, the Palace of Weddings in Vilnius are used quite, and is quite popular with the secular urban population for weddings. Another building, the Palace of Funerals in Kaunas, with very elaborate architecture, was put on the list, but it doesn't help to preserve it. It stays derelict. It's not in use, and the owner is, opposing the listing of this building, and he says that he waits until the building will collapse itself. Some buildings were lost, as I've told. Some buildings were lost on very alarming intentions, because you can see that an interesting concrete postmodernist cafe in Banga was demolished with the design to be built on its place in Palanga on the Baltic Sea. So it's a little bit of kind of Skopje tradition to replace modernism or postmodernism with something that's traditional. So the first conclusion can be done that there are two sorts of modernism, as David Crowley has claimed: the standard, the mass, and the custom designed. And there are two values. The first one is perceived as non-architecture, and if it's preserved, it's usually only renovation processes or insulation. And another one is perceived as architecture, and sometimes even restoration method is applied. But in contradiction to this, we can see one of the promising examples, the renovation of Vilnius University suburban campus. The student dormitory group has been recently renovated and insulated, but already accepting their architecture. And now you can see that it become kind of Bauhaus style photographed and left because of that. So only a touch of good renovation process with the architectural concern can help. Another conclusion can be that the very adjective Soviet is used as negative in modernist architecture only very dependently. Let's say it is dependent on investors' plans. We have seen that many buildings are used, and only negative meaning is used by PR campaigns only at certain points of negotiation with residents when there are plans to demolish the building. So it's more like economic but not ideological pressure. And I have two final examples. The road police administrative building in Vilnius and the sports and concert palace. So this, here you can see the architects gathering at the road police or GAI building in Vilnius last year when the plans announced to demolish it by the new development by Lidl. And architects heard that it's being demolished, but they treat it as most of the important postmodernist buildings built in '85, and you can see it from the very symptomatic axonometric design. But the most interesting thing that Mayor of Vilnius posted on his Facebook that it's an ugly building, and anybody who would say to me that it's beautiful, please give arguments. So architects came together giving him arguments and sending him postcards that it's a beautiful building, and we also made an exhibition that it is beautiful. With very simple statement, one object, the building, and we have produced postcards that it says that this is beautiful and this is beautiful. However, in the popular perception, it really was beautiful, ugly building, and 90% of population, Vilnius population, in the questionnaire supported demolition of it. Another thing is also this controversy about the Palace of Sports, which was put on the list in 2006 when there were plans to demolish it were announced. And then the investor started to use this negative adjective Soviet. It's a Soviet monster, and we have to get rid of it. But somehow the Heritage Department was taken to the court and won the court. And now, in 2014, the plans for renovation of it and to convert it to the National Palace of Congress were made, and now it is presented as interesting architecture. So that's my consideration. We still have to keep researching, spreading the knowledge, but you can see that main message that I wanted to say with this presentation and this research, that it's very pragmatic actually, and it's not consequently ideological. That is current situation with socialist heritage.
What I'm going to be talking about is possibly a slightly inappropriate way of looking at the problem of modernist preservation. And what I'm going to be talking about is what happens when you win, and the problematic things that can happen when you win. And when you win the extended argument about the value of modernist architecture. I say inappropriate because, of course, the first thing is that it's an extremely difficult argument to win a lot of the time. It takes usually years of publications, of arguments, of articles, of campaigns, to change that perception. I think more than any other form of architecture, it's something that's extremely hard to kind of convince people that work of that era is of value. And in Britain, I think that's probably taken maybe 25 years to get to that point. But if you walk around any art gallery shop, any design shop, read any colour supplement of a newspaper, read any design magazine or fashion magazine, or look at any set of a recent TV series or film, you will find that the argument has been fairly comprehensively won in Britain. By now, there is not just a kind of acceptance that architecture, particularly of the post-war period, is a value, but it's become a kind of cult, really. A cult in a way that I think only Victorian and Georgian architecture had previously become a kind of cult in Britain in the same way. That they'd both become kind of part of an entire lifestyle. And I think that the architectural heritage of that era has now become part of a very distinct lifestyle. And that, I think, sort of brings certain problems in its train. So I don't really want this to seem like sort of moaning in a way of kind of like, we got all our buildings preserved and it was terrible. That's not necessarily my point. But it's more a kind of, here are some things to be very, very careful of in the discussion of modern architecture, and things to be very, very careful of in the preservation of modern architecture. Particular actors to be wary of. So I'm going to begin with these two images of sort of modernist architectural kitsch, I suppose one could say, of sort of modernist architectural trinkets, which are very easily available in shops across the UK now. At the top you have one of many mugs produced by a company called People Will Always Need Plates. They do plates and mugs and tea towels printed with images of modernist buildings. Initially, quite a lot of them were of the 1930s, the kind of more sort of middle-class modernism in Britain in the 1930s, which I'll come to in a moment. But increasingly, they've been images of public housing estates, basically, of mass housing of one sort or another. And given that mass housing has always been associated in Britain with housing, particularly recently housing the poor, there's something quite strange about these sort of images of this housing being on tea towels bought by largely middle-class consumers. There's also something about them that they always, if you read interviews of the people that produce these plates and mugs and tea towels, it's very much about presenting the buildings as they originally looked, or kind of almost as sort of images of like an original blueprint, in which any sort of additions or changes or aging are very much sort of very deliberately ignored. Below that is a series of models called Brutal London, produced by a company called Zupa Graphica, who also have done similar little models. I think possibly they might even have done a Soviet Modernism one recently. And you can see here a kind of standard London County Council system-built block, and the Barbican, and Robin Hood Gardens, Balfron Tower, the Aylesbury Estate, and Space House, a speculative office block by the designer Richard Seifert. Two of these buildings are actually either under threat of demolition or currently being demolished at this point. So, again, in a way, this may seem slightly sort of exaggerated or paranoid to kind of see these things as having a negative role. If anything, maybe they have a positive role. People will see these things and see them differently and see them rather than being these sort of rainy, concrete monstrosities, as the phrase is frequently used. Carbuncles is another one. Rather than seeing them like this, people will then see them as, again, to use another frequently used cliche in Britain, see them as icons. And again, in that, it's been quite successful. But the sort of wider project has become increasingly problematic. So first, I think there's some important background on this, on sort of, on just how much, just how controversial modern architecture had become in Britain by the 1960s, and also how much the conservation movement in Britain was aimed at modern architecture, aimed at stopping modern architecture. So these are the two moments that generally, when people do the kind of Charles Jenks style, modern architecture died on 1970, whatever. When people do this in Britain, rather than talking about Pruitt-Igoe, they talk about either Covent Garden or Ronin Point. That's when modern architecture died for us. So Ronin Point, which you can see here, was a system-built, prefabricated tower designed for the London borough of Tower Hamlets by the speculative builders Taylor Wimpey, using the Danish Larsen-Nielsen system, which was supposed to go up to 8 stories. They built it up to 22. And a gas explosion in one of the flats led to this collapse. And collapses like that in certain circumstances are a risk in system-built buildings, as we now know. Usually with gas explosions. There was a fairly similar disaster in Dnipropetrovsk, I think, about 15 years ago. But generally, Britain doesn't compare itself with Dnipropetrovsk. So it was quite a shock that kind of people were sort of moving into what they considered to be sort of better housing outside of the sort of Victorian slums they'd lived in before, in which they would have central heating and inside toilets and bigger flats and electricity and all of this sort of stuff. And then to find out that they were unsafe. And so this was an enormous shock. And in many ways, modern architecture in Britain never recovered from this. Now, in many ways, like a lot of the sort of mass housing of the Soviet era, calling this architecture is possibly debatable. System-built blocks like this had minimal input, if at all, from architects. They were usually a kind of kit that was offered by a private developer to a public local authority who would then build them. Much more an engineering project than an architectural project. But nonetheless, architects were primarily blamed. This was seen as an example as the kind of consequence of Le Corbusier and the consequence of the Ville radieuse and the consequence of the sort of technologization of architecture, that this is where it would end up, of like people's houses just collapsing. And obviously, there's a recent example of a disaster in a British tower block that suggests that the lessons that were learned were severely misapplied, that blaming architects rather than blaming the structure and the building industry and the materials proved to be extremely foolish, given that the recent Grenfell Tower disaster is largely reckoned to have been caused by the plastic cladding added to a concrete tower block of the 1960s. The other kind of day modernism died is in 1973 with the cancellation of the redevelopment of Covent Garden. So Covent Garden, for those who don't know, was an area roughly between the original city of London, the medieval city of London, and the medieval city of Westminster. So it's the first thing that kind of bridged these two, creating modern London in the 17th and early 18th century. The Greater London Council, which at that point was controlled by the Conservative Party, produced this elaborate proposal to demolish everything apart from the listed buildings. So the Royal Opera House was listed and was preserved, the original market was preserved, and Inigo Jones's Palladian Church was preserved. The rest was going to go, just the lot. And a kind of multi-level retail, entertainment, and residential complex, resembling in some ways the Barbican that was then being developed in the City of London, was proposed. So this led to an enormous campaign of preservation, in which, again through the sort of very emotive language, in which modern architecture, which I think immediately after World War II had been seen as this kind of social democratic kind of object of progress and hope and so forth, had become instead a force that was considered totalitarian. It was considered Stalinist if you were on the political right. It was considered fascist if you were on the political left. It was seen as something quite alien and quite sinister in British life. But the way that this project was eventually cancelled, first there was a campaign locally, which included both the market traders who were on the site and also the kind of London intelligentsia who often lived nearby at the time. But it also involved a shift within the Greater London Council Architects Department. A lot of the architects working for London's government were very, very discontented with this scheme, and they essentially mounted a kind of coup within the Architects Department, took over the Architects Department, and cancelled the scheme. So in many ways, architects were sort of responsible for saving this, but that's seldom remembered. But the crucial thing that happened here is that every building on the site was listed. So overnight, the Greater London Council and English Heritage listed everything. So this included Victorian warehouses, early 20th century model housing, pubs, just lots of quite ordinary stuff that wouldn't otherwise, to that point, have been listed, would have been considered quite mundane, mass-produced Victorian architecture, was all suddenly preserved as a way of stopping anything like this from ever happening again. So in that, I think there's, this is where preservation comes from in Britain. Preservation is about saving the 19th century, basically, by stopping modernism. So that's made preserving modern architecture, in many ways, quite a counterintuitive thing. But there's a few quite positive examples of it, and in many ways, the most positive examples have been those that were the sort of most early on, and those that were done with the least fanfare, and those that had the least kind of redesign as part of them. In that, I would probably include most of all the changes in the Trellick Tower in London in the 1970s. So Trellick Tower was designed in the early 1970s by the Hungarian émigré architect Erno Goldfinger. Thank you. And was initially regarded as a sort of great social failure. The tabloid newspaper The Sun, the quite notorious tabloid newspaper The Sun, referred to it as the Tower of Terror. And after a while, this kind of moral panic subsided, and the local Tenants and Residents Association, which were quite strong, managed to convince the owners, the local authority of Kensington and Chelsea, to introduce a concierge, first of all, which generally housing doesn't have of any era in Britain, introduce a concierge, and to only let the flats out to people that wanted to live in them. So quite often tower blocks were what's considered hard to let, which means that the local authority that owns them will give them to people who are there's a sort of waiting list system, and it meant that, there's always a lot more of the tower blocks available, so you can get them much more easily. And frequently there's not, people sort of a little bit sort of dumped on them, or have been, particularly in the 80s and 1990s. Whereas Trellick Tower's residents had this kind of strict rule of like, you will only live in Trellick Tower if you want to live in Trellick Tower. And this had a very, very positive effect. The actual fabric of the building was not particularly changed. In the late 1990s, the first sort of wave of listings of modernist buildings took place. Or sort of post-war modernist buildings. Pre-war modernist buildings, which have been almost overwhelmingly for a middle-class clientele, were not controversial in the same way. The post-war sort of social democratic housing was controversial. So there was a kind of wave of listing. And among the buildings in that wave was Keeling House, a block in the East End of London designed by Dennis Lasdon. And realizing that they now had to renovate the building to listed building standards, the local authority, again Tower Hamlets Council, were essentially decided that it would be easier to just give it to a developer. That their budget would not necessarily pay for treating it properly, but if they sold it, they could make quite a lot of money because it was an architect-designed building which had become increasingly, again to use the term, iconic. So the people that lived there, who were by that point largely people that had lived there since it was built in the 1950s, were moved out, and the buildings were sold on the open market. Specifically marketed to what tend to be called creatives, or use Richard Florida's phrase, the creative class. There are penthouses at the top, newly added by the restoration architects, which you can just about see there. And among the people that bought was Damon Albarn of the band Blur. Probably a less worrying example, just a few years later, in around the early 2000s, was the renovation of the Brunswick Centre, another London sort of brutalist megastructure, which had been enduringly quite controversial. And here, the sort of different functions that were happening allowed a sort of more complex compromise between the original social ideas and the demands of the kind of quite ruthless capitalism brought in Britain in the 1980s. So the Brunswick Centre entailed public housing owned by the London Borough of Camden in these kind of step-back blocks based on the work of Antonio Santeglia, and on the ground floor a shopping centre. And so the council sold the shopping centre in the early 2000s to a private developer who then brought in chain stores. It used to have quite ordinary sort of noodle bars and working men's cafes and so forth. It was, and a laundrette, things like that. And now it has, coffee chains and a supermarket and places where you can buy mugs of the Brunswick Centre. And that, in a way, managed to preserve it as social housing because the council then had the money, which could then continue to, that meant that they could continue to provide the housing on the site. No one was moved out. But what it did mean was that you could purchase your flat at quite a low rate and then sell it for a huge amount. And in this, given the amount of time I've got, it's quite difficult to get too much into detail about this, but the housing system in Britain sort of initially worked as you had private housing and you had public housing. And public housing be allocated via a waiting list system by your local government, and you could live in that until you died, and then your family could live in it, but you couldn't sell it. And in the early 1980s, it was brought in that you could sell it. But not only could you sell it, the price that you would pay for it was specifically low, so that you could buy your flat here in Bloomsbury, so very, around the corner from the British Museum, an area probably with some of the highest real estate values in the world. You could buy your flat here for very, very little money, and then you could sell it for about $1 million. So it had this sort of role that it was so tempting for those that could afford to buy to do so. So by now, it's about 50% private housing, despite the fact that the actual structure has never been privatized. But that kind of incremental, point-by-point, sort of gradual gentrification of an area has been quite unpopular. What's happened much more often is just a developer has just bought or been given an area of public housing, and then they proceeded to gentrify it from there. the major example of this is Park Hill in the steel-making city of Sheffield in the north of England. And I could probably talk about Park Hill for 3 hours, so I will try not to. Park Hill was designed, I guess, to use the phrase that everyone likes to use. It was a sort of social condenser at the end of the 1950s. Had very, very wide deck access streets, which were supposed to encourage social interaction. It had a very, very large kind of shopping centre. It had 4 pubs. It had a public toilet. It had a butcher and a baker and a candlestick maker. And it was a kind of intended to be a sort of recreate the sort of 19th century working class community in a modernist form. That was the idea behind it. That was the kind of driving force of Park Hill. In terms of its architecture, the idea was sort of brutalism in its original, as it was originally conceived in the 1950s, to use Rainer Banham's phrase about an ethic or aesthetic. The designers of Park Hill, Jack Lynn and Ivor Smith, considered what they were doing to be an ethic, first and foremost, and an aesthetic, second. They boasted about the fact that they didn't draw elevations of the buildings. So you have a kind of very, very large concrete frame, which winds around a very hilly site. It goes from 3 stories to 14 without ever going up the stairs, because the site goes like that, and it's a kind of gradient like that. And the building was again listed in the late 1990s in this kind of great kind of tranche of listings of famous post-war estates. And again, the price of maintaining it was prohibitively high for the local authority. Since the mid-1980s, local authority budgets had been severely cut, so that these bodies that used to build gigantic quantities of housing no longer had the money to maintain that housing. So Park Hill's kind of slightly later cousin building, Hyde Park, just slightly up on the hill, got sort of reclad with sort of ceramic cladding and is unrecognizable from its original form. And that's always what a local authority would rather do. You put some cladding on that's cheap, that a building company will do for you, and that gets the heating bills down, and that's it. And you couldn't do this at Park Hill because it had been listed. So one of the reasons why it was given rather than sold in this case to a developer was because of the fact that you couldn't just clad it. You had legally to maintain its original form, which is funny because one of the things that then the developers that it was given to, a Manchester-based developer who sort of market their stuff to creative class types, called Urban Splash, is that they completely destroyed the physical fabric of the building. The bricks were, which were in sort of different colours, gradating from top to bottom, were removed. Everything was removed, in fact, apart from the concrete frame. And aluminium panels were added in bright colours. So the strange thing about this story is, the eventual consequence of the act of listing it as a historic building was the complete destruction of its historic fabric and the complete destruction of its social purpose. But you can buy it on all kinds of tea towels, T-shirts. I've seen people, there was a picture doing the rounds of people with Park Hill tattoos. It's very popular, but also it doesn't really do what it used to do. Something quite similar in many ways is currently happening to the Balfron Tower, which is a slightly earlier version of the tower that Erno Goldfinger later designs in West London as Trellick Tower. And here the process was that initially residents were balloted to transfer from a local authority to a charitable housing association, and told that if they didn't do this, there wouldn't be money to redevelop the building, to sort out its insulation problems and its deteriorating fabric and so forth. So what actually happened was that housing association then found that they couldn't afford to maintain it either. So they decided to sell it to private developers as again, sort of marketing it as a great modernist icon and an image of utopia and so forth. But before they did this, they cleared out the flats of the residents who were moved elsewhere in East London, and then started opening the empty flats as artist studios. So there's this long process that's all quite well known of, kind of area changes when artists or musicians or whoever move into an area, and then it becomes desirable, and then people with real money come in. And this kind of process that usually takes years and years and years was just going to be done by the owners of this building overnight. First, we're going to get the people out because they're too bloody poor for this building. Then we're going to get the artists in, and then we're going to get them out. then we're going to get the bankers in, and then we'll have the money to repair the building. So these, I think, these specific examples, I think, are quite cautionary. But whether or not they're plausible to happen anywhere that doesn't have the extremely overheated property market of Britain is probably quite unlikely. It's quite telling that Park Hill, the only one of my examples not in London, has not actually been a commercial success, whereas all the London examples have been enormous commercial successes. So I want to talk a little bit about the way that I think this has happened, and the way in which these buildings have become desirable. And partly I think it's been the sort of nostalgia and the sort of sentimentality towards this stuff as design. And I think this is a sort of fashion cycle, really, that after anything's been around for long enough, eventually it becomes fashionable and people become nostalgic about it, and it becomes cute and it becomes a part of heritage. And this is an inevitable process. Which is currently happening, I think, to postmodernism, and will inevitably happen to things that inevitably eventually people will be nostalgic for Zaha Hadid and Rem Koolhaas. It's just what happens. There's a more interesting process which is paralleling this, which is the revaluation of the politics that produced this in the first place. And here, I'd like to point to the recent film by the film director Ken Loach called The Spirit of 45. And this is one of several kind of films and books that have tried to a sort of a revisionist approach to the architecture of the not the architecture, but the sort of system that produced the architecture of the welfare state, which in the 1980s had been seen as as sort of statist and repressive and so forth, was increasingly being seen in a positive way by people that had not benefited from the things that it provided. So things like full employment, unemployment benefit, free education, National Health Service just about still survives, but most of these things have been dismantled. And I think there was a new generation that were very much kind of like, wouldn't it be nice to have those things? And how did it come about that we no longer have them? And that, I think, is a much more interesting question. But a lot of the discourse around the architecture of that era, I think, has stayed at a fairly vacuous level. The amount of coffee table books in the last, I'd say 3 years in Britain on brutalist architecture in particular, but modernist architecture in general, has become off the scale. You can go to bookshops now and there will be an entire wall of this sort of stuff. Almost always without context, without history, without description, and crucially without accounts from people that have actually lived in those places. That kind of emphasis on the one hand was quite interesting because again, when you're making the argument for modern architecture, and you will all have heard this a million times, people will say, well, you wouldn't live there, would you? If you like it so much, if you like your concrete monstrosity so much, why don't you go and live in it? And this book, of course, was full of people that really had gone and done that. But then the other people that had done that, that had been doing this for 50 years, did not feature. But my favorite of these books is a thing called This Brutal World by the graphic designer Peter Chadwick. And what he does is take black and white, well, he Google searches black and white images of modernist buildings and then has quotations from the likes of Nick Cave and Ayn Rand. So here we have some buildings, including the Falkirk Wheel, a engineering structure in Scotland, next to the quote from Ayn Rand, "The question isn't who is going to let me, it's who is going to stop me." Next to it, you have Nick Cave telling you, under Eric Mendelsohn, that out of longing, great wonders have been willed. So this kind of level of just like absolute kitsch that now sort of infects the discourse around modern architecture is quite interesting to me, partly because it resembles so much the discourse around Victorian architecture that kind of launched the preservation movement in Britain in the first place. That there, rather than kind of historicizing the Victorian era and seeing it in its complexity and its the good and the bad things about it, and as a sort of lived historical experience, it instead became a series of images and a series of cliches, which everyone agreed were wonderful. And seeing that happening to modern architecture, I think, is intensely ironic. So this is from 2 property adverts for modern buildings. Here is a picture from the website Rightmove, where you can buy, where you're sort of renting and housing is kind of as a sort of aggregator. And you log on to that, and then that takes you to the estate agents. This is a flat in the Brunswick Centre being offered for £950,000. And below that is an image from the website of Urban Splash advertising flats in Park Hill for the considerably lower amount of £80,000, which I think tells you something about Britain's geography. Here, the quote from the architect: "We wanted to capture more permanently that vision, that moment of vision, optimism, and personality that seemed to have been lost." And I think here you have to remember that their method of recapturing what they consider to be the utopian moment of post-war architecture, their way of recapturing vision and optimism and so forth, is to completely eviscerate the buildings of all their original ideas, both social and architectural. And I think I should probably stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me on this very interesting conference. I found very many things very similar to our context, and in some cases I may also repeat some stories, and we can compare it at the end, I think. I will just talk about some steps and conditions after the collapse of Soviet Union, and what happened to the modernist architecture in Georgia. And also I will try to put this transformations into the context, political and economical context, and the history of Georgia of the last decade. So yeah, the story is very familiar, as you see on the photo. This is the Freedom Square in Tbilisi, and just right after the collapse of the Union, this attack on the monuments were done, but actually it went quite far, because the aggression and these emotions were also addressed to the architecture as well. And you see here this building, Imeli building, the former institute of Marx, Engels and Lenin in Tbilisi, that was designed by Alexei Shusev in 1938. And it was also, these bas-reliefs on the building were attacked during 90s. Although the bas-reliefs were done by the very famous Georgian sculptor Yakov Nikoladze, and also part of them was created by the sculptor Tamara Bagelia, and they were also partly demolished. And in early 90s, also the former hotels and resort complexes transformed into the emergency shelters. Due to the Abkhazian conflict, we had a huge amount of IDPs in Georgia that were located in the hotels and in the buildings of the mostly Soviet, late Soviet period, and that they still are some kind of emergency shelters till today, and the whole life inside the buildings were transformed according to new function, new permanent function of the buildings. And another typical thing that happened during 90s was the destruction of the whole institutions, project institutions and architectural institutions that were working on the projects, and their archives were either destroyed or burned or I don't know. And I will talk about our work later in the, at the end of my presentation about our work. So these were three main tendencies, I may say, that referred to the Soviet architectural in a very general way. But the transformation was very visible and I may say very painful after the Rose Revolution and in 2003. Actually, the Rose Revolution and this new context put Georgia in a very different, slightly different, I may say, position, because the neoliberal policy was implemented very clearly, I may say. And this neoliberal policy had its very clear shapes and forms. And this was the ideology through which we were going. And also it combined different layers as well, layers of narratives as well. Because the first intervention into public space and first action towards the architecture that happened after the Rose Revolution happened on the former Republic Square. This square was created in 1980s, but there were standing other buildings also from Soviet period, and the first thing that Saakashvili, after he gained the power, did he destroyed the monument on the Freedom Square, this composition of arcs. Actually, this composition was also called the Years of Andropov, who was the Communist Party leader at that period. So, but actually, according to the architect Otar Kalandarishvili, it was just a composition of Fontaine or something like that. But actually, the place was created for for parades and mass events in the public space, because Tbilisi had no such place actually, and it was introduced quite in a late period. But also this was not only, and it had was a clear message as well, that the architecture now became a symbolic part of the new policy and new government policy. I mean, because it was a symbolic act to destroy the Soviet past or the physical manifestation of the Soviet past in the public space. A lot of narratives are very similar, that everything that is Soviet should be, we should erase this past away and from our history, and something new identity should be built on that. It was a symbolic act also because they had no plan how to replace this monument. In the later period, also a very significant architectural tendency was implemented by the government, building the glass architecture, glass and steel architecture to somehow give a symbolic meaning that the system is transparent and also the system is modern. So Saakashvili was going to modernize the country. And also on this square, there was standing a significant, quite interesting piece of late Soviet modernism from 60s, Hotel Iberia, that had very these 3 phases and 3 layers of its history. And also, after the Rose Revolution, I may say that it was also this emergency shelter for the IDPs from Abkhazia, and in the middle of the photo you see this transformation of the building during 90s. So it was standing in the heart of the city, representing this whole history of our past few years. The privatization, the building was privatized right after the Rose Revolution, and the people were given some compensation and they left the place. But it was also a message that there is no place for the poor people in the city center. There is no place for poor people in the touristic area. So this tendency, when you look from this perspective, from today's perspective, when the Londoners are attacked in the public space and etc., it's quite sounds quite real, I mean. And also the transformation of this old Soviet building into a new modern Radisson Blu Iberia hotel with this glass and new modern look, I may say. It was also the message that the country is going to be modern and to modernize its future. But also here we're standing, and these are the layers in this public space, and I think that it's quite interesting place in Tbilisi. Here in front of the Iberia building was standing the monument of the King David the Builder, who is the iconic political leader of Georgia from 11th century. And the government decided to put this monument in the other place because for the investment company this monument looked not quite well in this area. So it was also another message that if something disturbs the investment or such kind of development, everything can be done. Even the statue can be moved from that place. The statue of the very beloved historical figure, even. Right after the Rose Revolution, it's very important to mention that this mass privatization project started, and the public buildings were privatized very intensely. And also it was linked with the deregulation policy that had a huge influence on urban development, because it was possible to receive a building permission just, I don't know, in a 3-day or in a week. So the time is really very short for such decisions, but as the policy was to develop the country economically very fastly, such decisions were made that had a huge influence on the city, and also this modernist architecture was also attacked, and mostly the buildings that were standing in the city center. For example, this is one of the examples from late 20s. The Institute of, it was a former Institute of History and Ethnography, but before that it was an tuberculosis institute, and it was some kind of constructivist architecture with a local spice, I may say. But it was also photographed. You see these two photos by Margaret Bourke-White, who traveled in 30s in USSR with the American journalist to discover the Soviet health policy. And these pictures became part of the book Red Health, if I am not wrong, yeah. Red Healthcare, yeah. And just recently the building was destroyed, and the new proposal that the company proposes, it was also privatized. It was an institute, it was privatized. The institute were taken somewhere, I don't know, not in the city center, of course. And also it's very funny that the architects and the company tries to say that it's a restoration, actually. And in the Georgian government, Georgian law, there are no certain definition, because when you accord to the permission, you can write conservation, restoration, reconstruction, and I don't know, alteration. And everything this is perceived as something very similar to each other. Another case, also in the city center, this was the restaurant Aragvi from 70s, and just recently it was destroyed in 2008 to build a huge hotel complex on the area, but the complex was not realized. But just a few days ago, these visualizations were spread during in the social media, showing this transformation of the territory. So yeah, and the tourism, direct foreign investment became the driver of the economy of the city and the country in general. So the hotel projects are implemented in each and every part of the city center. So this is also another example from 70s. This was standing right on this building was standing right on the Freedom Square, and actually it was really very careful towards the context in which it was put. You can see it on the right photo, and now a huge hotel is under construction, and the owner of the complex is our former Prime Minister, this oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili. So, and it is a part of a huge project of Panorama that is an enormous intervention into historical district and destroying the value of it, etc. And there is also another example of 80s, and I think it's a marvelous place. It was a marvelous building from my point of view. It's my subjective opinion. But yeah, it was also destroyed, and now there will be a hotel again. So yeah, and to go back to the to this whole context and how this developmentalist or modernization project was linked with the Soviet legacy and Soviet history. Now you see this monument from Soviet period, very interesting piece, was destroyed in 2009 to build a new parliament building. And this phrase by one of the officials is quite interesting. We don't want our children's taste to be ruined by communist architecture. We want beautiful buildings, and we want the next generation to grow up with good taste. This will help them live in a better and more dignified way. So, and you can compare. Yeah, and actually, this whole modernization project was, as I mentioned, followed with the implementation of new architectural style and new direction. Saakashvili was bringing a lot of foreign architects into the country, giving them, commissioning them, and yeah, this is the banner of one of the famous architecture magazines, and this banner was hanging on the former parliament building on the Rustaveli Avenue, and saying that, yeah, we are now a brand new country at the moment, yeah. And also, I want to talk about a bit my personal experience and my activist experience. I mentioned this privatization policy, and actually in 2012, in summer, there was spread a news that the Ministry of Economics is going to sell the scientific library. National Scientific Library. The building was built in 70s. Here you see the building, and it was the first building built according to these purposes only, for library purposes only. And it was a part of a scientific city, so-called scientific city complex. And the building was really very was preserved in a very good condition. And also here you can see this roofing construction that is tested by the, created by Georgian engineers, and yeah, they are testing it in the workshop, and then you see how they built it. And yeah, the building was preserved in a very good condition, but actually the Ministry of Economics was saying that it was a former library. And also they were suggesting to the investor to convert the building in the shopping center and entertainment center. So it was the 2012, the Docomomo Georgia was newly established. Also, this was the year when the first big event to protect the cultural heritage happened, like it was a Gudiashvili Square movement. So it was a pre-election year, and we started to think how to protect the building. And we were thinking, should we talk about the architectural value of the building, or should we more stress the public importance of the building? And the discussion was, we thought that we will lose if we just stress and just make accent on the architectural value. So we decided to build our strategy on the topic that this is a public space that will be privatized, and we will lose the public space, actually. That is very important for the city. And we created a Facebook page, and in a couple of days it received a huge resonance. Because I mentioned that these struggles towards the city has been started, the big events had happened, it was pre-election year, and the people were motivated very much to be involved and engaged in protection issues, because we had a lot of cases. So it caused a huge aggression and huge resonance, and very fastly, after a month, the building was taken out of the privatization list. And we managed to save the building. Now it is standing, now it has funding, and now it is developing on its way. And I won't be wrong if I say that it is the only clear example when the urban activists had some success, actually, because all of the cases are either in progress or the battles are lost. And we decided after that to work with the library, to make workshops, to discuss the further development of the library, of the concepts, and we were working together, producing some ideas. Until today, our organization is somehow advising the institution, and it's also a very rare case because the institution is really very open to collaboration, and it's amazing. And also, our organization started to collect the documents. As I showed in the first slides, the archives are destroyed, most part of them. So we started with half of Ruben and our team to collect the materials from the private archives of architects, to collect them, to interview them, and to preserve the knowledge about this period of architecture in that way. So there were some other projects like exhibitions, small publications, but mostly we decided not to be our activism our strategy was to put it in the more scientific way, or to collect the information, because it was the exceptional case of the library, and I am not sure if they will be more in this conditions. Actually, I want to add also that although the government has changed, the economic policy is the same. So the pressure is the same, and the direction is same. Nothing has changed except of the freedom of speech and the feeling of freedom, that you can express your ideas more freely than it was before. But actually the policy has not changed. Urban policy has not changed. Cultural policy has not changed. the situation is more or less the same. Thank you very much.
During this panel, we discussed pretty much the present-day state. I will go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s and try to depict the development of the architectural culture in ex-Yugoslavia and Croatia, but focused on the typology of tourism industry, and so on. Trying to prove that general comprehension of the architecture of Central Eastern Europe and socialist countries was not innovative, experimental, avant-garde whatsoever at that time. Actually, it was, and especially in the case of Yugoslav tourist hotels. I will try to show how in this quite codified and commodified typology, some sort of advancements and even social contributions could happen. My research started back in 2007 at the conference at the Etihad Zurich, organized by Akos Moravanski. It's pity that he's not here. He could for sure contribute to this debate. But nevertheless, in 2007, my lecture was quite structured. Nowadays, it's not structured anymore, but I collected lots of beautiful images, either in color or black and white. But nevertheless, my research was formatted or resulted in a book, Holidays After the Fall, edited by Mikhail Zinganel, which dealt with the tourist architecture in Croatia and Bulgaria, and in the series of documentary films commissioned by Croatian National Television, 4 episodes of 52 minutes dealing with this, I would say, quite interesting topic. There is a lack of color. What used to be the color, now it's black and white. Okay, Yugoslavia in between East and the West, as you know, after 48, 49 and the famous no from Tito to Stalin, Yugoslavia developed its own way towards the better future, concept of self-managed socialism, operated between East and the West, and pretty much the map should show it, but you can imagine. Of course, important part of the Yugoslav territory was littoral part that belongs to the Mediterranean Adriatic culture. And during the 50s and 60s, the rapid urbanization of this area took place, mainly through the tourism, and especially mass tourism. To some extent, the mass tourism was propelled, of course, by the international global currents, but there is certainly, to some extent, some ideological pretext to it. In 1949, with the succession of Yugoslavia from the Eastern Socialist Bloc, strong propaganda started to bomb or attack Yugoslav socialism, accusing him for not being human, for not being real, and so on. And Josip Broz Tito in 1950 declared this famous saying, "Come and see the truth," which became the first slogan for Yugoslav tourism, to make the issue quite simple. Of course, that this ideological pretext was primarily motivated by the need for the hard currency, so the economy was essential in that respect. And again, Tito in 1962 said, okay, our Adriatic Sea is of course beautiful, but this is no longer the case that someone would come just because of the natural beauty. We need to provide something more. And let us remind us about the ambiences of the Mediterranean. This is, for example, the city of Stone. It was a small colony of the city of Dubrovnik, a planned city from the beginning of the 13th century, and then you see the cultivated landscape, the salt plants, and then, of course, the sea and the quite dramatic and interesting landscape. And as Mira Marasovic, one of the main planners of the Yugoslav tourism and Yugoslav urban planning at the coast, declared the tourism economy is quite specific because unlike in other economical fields, products don't come to the consumer, but consumer come to the product. Product itself is a space, and space is the main resource of the economy of tourism. And again, let's try to remember what type of activity is tourism, mass tourism. This is a photograph by Italian photographer Massimo Vitali, which depict the all bizarrities of the mass tourism. It's about a large number of people squeezed at the quite limited area of space, enjoying in mostly profound and banal activities. So architects and urban planners had to deal, with the design for the largest number, dealing with the most profane activities. So as early as late 1950s, urban planners started to do research. Okay, how should we deal with the urbanization of the coast? Meticulous scanning of the whole coast was done. 2 pilot projects were conducted for Makarska Riviera and Šibenik Riviera, with the idea, okay, let's scan all the already existing elements in the space, existing settlements, topography, even existing roads and paths, and try to devise some strategy or concepts how to deal with the future congestion. And congestion was obvious when you read the numbers. Already existing accommodation capacities were 250,000, while the planned capacities were 2.5 million of tourists at the coast. We have to know that the Croatian population at that time and today still is 4.5 million. So compare these 2 numbers and you really understand what type of pressure is going to come at the Croatian and Yugoslav coast from the 50s onwards with the influx of the mass tourism. And certain knowledge was already present, I mean knowledge regarding the urban planning and the architecture. For example, the city of Opatija in the northern Adriatic, known as Habsburg Nica, built at the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century, a tourist town. Architecture completely imported. There is nothing much authentic in the industry of tourism in general whatsoever, but certain amount of knowledge and even urban forms were already present. Precondition for the development of tourism, of course, is infrastructure. For example, Adriatic Highway, built from Italy to the Albania and to the Greece, mainly financed by the NATO. Why? Because they wanted to use this connection in case of war. Yugoslavia was some sort of in-between country, so the infrastructure for the tourism was built out of the money which was the result of the Cold War divisions. So basically military infrastructure in service of the local economy. And of course the motorway, new highway and so on introduced also a new kind of typologies. For example, this motel in Sljeme, there was a series of these prefabricated motels built around the coast. What's really, I think, interesting here is the relationship between the historical city of Trogir and the new motel. You see the interpolation of new urban layer within the historical and natural tissues. I think this coexistence of the old and new is super interesting. The strategy of distancing from the historical cores, but always in proximity in order to create some sort of dialectic relationship. What's important here is that the locals quite quickly appropriated these new tourist spaces as part of their everyday life. So motels, hotels and so on became popular places for going for drinks, to have weddings, prom parties and so on. This building is now a listed cultural monument. Of course, airports, without the tourism we wouldn't have that much airports at the Yugoslav coast. So this rapid urbanization really introduced some new facilities which would never happen without the mass tourism. And the early hotels from the 1960s, iconic objects inserted either in the nature or in the urban environments, almost heroic architecture. I would say that at that time, maybe the most ambitious architecture was produced, especially in the field of the tourism. But what's important again is you observe these new lighting systems, you see the new stairways and so on. So new public infrastructure was implemented in these environments, introducing, of course, new urban forms and so on. It's important to note that neither of these hotels or tourist resorts were not gated communities. They were totally open to the local communities. Therefore, they could really function as integral part of local social life, but urban life as well. Lots of confidence in entering sensitive historical environments. Excelsior Hotel in Dubrovnik, for example. You see again this dialectics now between the historical center of Pearl of Adriatic Dubrovnik and the new international style modernism. And then again, similar condition in Opatia, in the environment surrounded by Habsburg Villa. Now you have this radical, modern, but not very original Adriatic, Ambassador Hotel from the early 60s. Here, the interior is more interesting. The debate about synthesis of so-called plastic arts or visual arts was very active in Yugoslavia at the time, of course, elsewhere in Europe as well. But mainly in the field of the discussions in the theory and so on. But hotels became probably the most important places where this concept could, at least to some extent, be tested. And for example, in the Ambassador Hotel, this quite impressive list of A1 artists were gathered under the supervision for visual arts Boris Vigentin, who at that time was director of influential gallery of modern and contemporary art in Vijeka. So you can really understand the ambition, and all the names listed here who did the art applications were really super prominent artists. And then again, of course, graphic design and uniforms and furniture, everything was designed within this idea of socialist Gesamtkunstwerk. The pool, the room in which architect Zdravko Bregovac lived for a year. Why? Because he wanted to prove or test the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk. Does it really work? Basically, it's quite generic room. There is nothing really special, but nevertheless, this is a good idea how architects could provide homes, at least temporary homes for themselves. This is a bit more interesting, mural painting by Edo Murtic, I think quite interesting one. Abstract expressionism, again in the bar. So you can see again this blend of prosaic activities of drinking martini and champagne with the background of this quite amazing painting, I would say. But this was not only singular artistic intervention. All the hotel was covered with this type of super ambitious, large-scale artistic interventions, and therefore these hotels functioned as some sort of odd, bizarre collections of modern and contemporary art, which communicated both to the locals and to the international audience, communicating basically the idea how Yugoslavia was open and modern, but nevertheless I wouldn't emphasize this ideological fact, but the fact that the tourists and the locals were exposed to the most modern art of the time. The same artists, and pretty much within the same aesthetic idiom, did, for example, the ceiling of the building of League of the Communist headquarters in Zagreb. So you see how the same aesthetics was applied to the hotels and to the spaces of the highest ideological importance. But when you travel and you do the documentary films, you discover that this type of aesthetics could be applied to most banal places. For example, this is in Motel Atures in Crkvenica. This is the partitioning wall between the kitchen and the restaurant, the most prosaic space in the hotel. Nevertheless, Murtic again. But in the basement, when there is a bowling area, beautiful mural by Oton Gliha. I think this is a really compelling example how the popular culture and high culture could be blended. Here I'm standing with the chief receptionist, who actually grew up with the motel. As a kid, she would come here and then later on bowl here, and she said to me that this art collection, Murtic at the upper floor, Gliha here in the basement, and several other art interventions as well, changed her worldview, her appreciation of modernist aesthetic. So we have these claims from the first hand, from the people who were exposed to this type of spaces and interventions, that this idea or possibility to blend these opposed concepts could actually be operative. And we spoke about the healing devices already today. This is one of the ultimate healing devices. Alongside with this hotels primarily meant for the Western tourists, but also for domestic and some people from the East as well. Network of social welfare facilities were built. Right to the vacation, to the holiday, was one of these rights proclaimed by self-management socialism. And Children's Health Resort in Krvavica is one of the prime examples of this type of facilities. Hovering ring, which was meant to accommodate kids with the lung diseases. So now we are in 1969, we already have penicillin, but nevertheless this idea of architecture as a healing device, exposure to the fresh sun, to the sea, to the fresh air and so on, was deeply embedded in the project. Here you really can see how the architectural form and this idea of healing could be really completed in quite compelling manner. Inner courtyard, mediating between the institution and the public space. This was the meeting point between the kids and the locals, because they would watch television, for example, together in the communal facilities and so on. So some sort of idea of social condenser is present as well here. Entrance hall with the ramp leading to the upper terrace, and then view towards the sea. I mean, the highest possible standard offering to the children. Nowadays also protected as a cultural monument, which is to some extent result-wise it's still empty. And aerial view to this healing device. Here it really looks like a super convincing device. And then after the series of singular interventions, singular hotels, more complex urbanistic systems started to develop. This is project for Brela Hotel area, designed in the early 60s, almost Scandinavian sensibility. Actually, designers and the architects were locals who were living in this area. They knew every tree, they knew every hill. So this distribution of freestanding volumes in the topography was closely related to the local conditions. Here is the image showing one flagship hotel of this system. Up there you can see the historical settlements. Historical settlements in this part of Adriatic were normally built up there because of the danger of pirates. So the tourism architecture was the first architecture which came closer to the beach. Or closer to the sea, radically reconfiguring the distribution of the buildings within the territory. Also the different notion of the beauty between the male and female beauty between 60s and 70s. I'm using many of the photographs from the company which was specialized in the, advertising and marketing in tourism from that time. So therefore people look a bit different than today. A close-up of the hotel, look at the section. Ratio of public spaces and accommodation units was 1:1, which is totally impossible to imagine today. Why? Again, because it was meant also to service the local community. And interior space, you see the sequence of terraces which goes through the interior, replicating the topographical givens within the volume of the building. From the outside it looks like a super abstract international style architecture, but from the inside it's much more sophisticated and more clearly related to the local topographical givens. And here this idea of synthesis of plastic arts was, I think, more successful. All the furniture's artistic interventions were placed in more meticulous, more careful way. Everything was coordinated in much better way. And luckily this ambient is pretty much the same even today with all the original details. A year and a half ago I wrote preliminary conservation document which stands in the drawer of the local conservation authorities. Let's hope that we will manage to do something with this hotel which will not ruin its original allure. And the same architect Ante Rožić in following years quickly tested different aesthetics and approaches to the issues of tourism in the hotel. The next project is Hotel Berulia, designed just 2 years after the Maestral. Here we can see introduction of some elements of, let's say, structuralism, but okay, let's try to make a hotel more closer to the nature, and in order to do that you have to break it into smaller volumes, introduce system of atriums and so on. And you can see the trees are quite high, so they were obviously building the hotel around already existing trees. So if we speak about sensitivity towards the nature and so on, here it is super present. And then his next project, just like 200 or 300 meters distant from the previous hotel, is Tourist Center Umbrella, late 60s. Proto-critical regionalism. Kenneth Frampton was still studying in London Architectural Association, but here you can see some sort of attempt to reconcile Mediterranean architecture in this roofscape covered with the tiles, but within a very dense network of pedestrian passageways and volumes. Here from the close-up it's even more clear what I'm talking about, but some elements of modernist urban planning is present as well. As you can see, some of the pedestrians were led to these terraces up there, so this three-dimensional network of public spaces inserted within the, this dense cluster of volumes. And in the interior of this pseudo-regionalist building, you see the interior of post office, this beautiful undulating wall, which clearly reflects some sort of programmatic of cybernetic arts, which was flourishing at the time in Zagreb with the new tendencies movement at the late 60s, early 70s. So again, these tourism facilities as a testing ground how to apply the most advanced research in visual arts into these installations in space. And then again, another peculiar example of social condenser, hotel, which is also a town hall, in the small town of Rabat, in the city, or in a village, actually, a fisherman village, where nothing of public notion ever existed. Here, the terrace of the hotel became also the main square, with a bank, with the post office, with some municipality facilities, with a supermarket, of course. And you can clearly see here the overlapping of social local dynamics and tourism as well. I'm not sure if the tourist would complain because of the noise of the locals when they were watching football matches at the terrace, but nevertheless, it was quite successful. The mass tourism was boosting, and the need for more comprehensive regional planning occurred. So in the late 60s and early 70s, a series of regional plans were developed in collaboration with the United Nations, advocating the idea of so-called integral planning, where spatial planning, economical planning, cultural planning, all sorts of planning were blended in some sort of comprehending utopian idea that future development in 20 or 30 years could really be predicted. Of course, this was the utopian, but nevertheless, you see the list of including experts who participated into this quite advanced planning endeavor. The challenging or redefining the divisions between East and the West, because both consultants from the Eastern and Western countries were collaborating on the same task. I would just also wanted to point out that the total cost of the operation was $7 million in the value of 1972, but when recalculated in the contemporary value, it's $38 million invested into the urban planning, which is almost impossible to imagine today. And of course, from the regional scale, these plans were also developed for the smaller scale. For example, each island would get this type of booklet where all the already existing givens were meticulously included in the future development of local communities, but as well the tourist resorts. This is one funny image from one of these plans. This is the idea how planners comprehend the day of the tourists. Just to mention that the tourist was meant to sleep from 11 till 7 a.m. You see that fishing occurs in the early morning and the evening, and all the other activities was also somehow planned within this time frame of one day. And then these activities would be distributed into the territory. So this just to illustrate the methodologies of planning at that time, which then resulted of this type of tourist cities, Babin Cook Resort near Dubrovnik. It was not completed entirely in this way, but nevertheless, this idea of twin cities, which would complement historical cities in order not to condense too much with the touristic pressure. You have to accommodate these 2.5 million people somewhere, so this type of mixed typology occurred as a new strategy, but also some sort of criticism of hotels of the 60s, for example, Jure Neidhardt, who studied with Le Corbusier in 1930s, based in Sarajevo, said we need to build more hotel dormitories and less hotel temples, and this is his self-initiated project for the Hotel Agava, which is some sort of concrete plant inserted into the topography with a minimal dwelling, with the emphasis of spending your free time in the nature. And then some utopian ideas, for example, this system of floating artificial islands, which would protect the coast from the congestion. Oh, I need at least 10, sorry. Okay, a series of megastructures appeared as a reaction to this raise of demand and need for the accommodation. Hotel Marina Lučica near Primošten. Again, here this is completely clear. Again, dialectics between the new tourist cities and the old settlements, but with the idea to again work with the nature, some sort of proto-landform architecture, which follows the logic of the already existing contour of the terrain, and to keep the building as low as possible in order not to be visible neither from the historical centers, neither from the highway. Here the greenery has not grown up yet, but nevertheless nowadays it's almost invisible from all the vantage points. And the tourist cities, mega structures, Hotel Plat near Mlini. When we did the model of the hotel, we realized that it's a prime example of organic architecture. They almost did not touch the already existing topography, but they built this super complex structure along the rock, creating this very complex spatial organism with the atriums, which introduced both light inside, but also created some sort of environment which is close to the tradition of Mediterranean architecture, creating again some sort of specific social landscape, because accommodation units were mixed with different other types of programs in order to maintain the whole building as active as possible. One megastructure, brutalism in Opatija again. Just want to point your attention to the system of terraces, which were meant to be extended over the existing street. So this introduction of public space within the urban tissue of the city. First, computer-controlled ceiling in the bar, unfortunately not existing anymore. And one of the most beautiful examples, Hotel Libertas in Dubrovnik, completely blended with the landscape, again, landform architecture. This is the second phase of the project with the greenery. And this is how it was actually built. This is still under construction without the greenery, which colonized the building, completely abolishing the idea of architecture as autonomous object, the other nature, let's say. And this is the view from the room, where everybody could enjoy its own little Mediterranean garden. And then hotel cities, well-known or notorious Haludovo complex near Malinska in island of Krk, Boris Magaš, who devised this idea of emulation of traditional settlement with a central hotel which should act as palazzo, and the accommodation units which emulated city walls, and the atrium villas distributed in between. And then again, some sort of organic relationship between the architecture and the nature. The tree didn't grow up afterwards. This is immediately after the completion of the atrium villas, main palazzo. And almost extravagant postmodernist, postmodernist language. The building was heavily criticized as not being authentic, as being too American, whatever that means. But the interior pretty much fulfills most of the criticism which Bonaventura Hotel received. John Portman, you know, the famous who did the Owen, help me. Frederick Jameson analysis of Bonaventura Hotel, but we can't go into the details. But actually, to some extent, it was American because immediately after the completion of the hotel, Bob Guccione, the publisher of the Penthouse magazine, appeared as a partner in the business, who brought pen girls, opened the casino, and it was a gambling mecca for Americans who would fly there and enjoy both Mediterranean socialism and gambling and pet girls brought by Guccione. So this is a little bit of trivia of Cold War. And then war and dissolution of Yugoslav socialism in 1990s, you see the decline of the numbers which are now going back into the normal. What happened in Spain, for example, at the same time, Benidorm, which MVRDV, famous Dutch company, used as a prime example of extreme capacities. So this is one possible strategy which is quite different to the Yugoslav one. Of course, there's the other side of the coin of Yugoslav modernization, wild settlements. This is also the tourist town, so-called apartment units built by the locals. This is the interior of Haludovo nowadays, owned by the Armenians. Ara Abramian is the owner. So again, a little bit of local trivia, but nevertheless, so beautiful ruin. There is this porn ruin, which is in the internet and in publication, mostly related to the Yugoslav memorials, to the anti-fascist fight and so on, but there is a porn ruin here as well in Haludovo. This is Libertas Hotel, redesigned by Turks. It gets 3 or 4 more stories. It's not organic anymore, but nevertheless it's new, all new. This is the current distribution of accommodation beds available. You see that private accommodation is almost 50%. Hotels are only 14% because of these deregulation processes and so on, but I can't go into details. New type of hotels, new type of tourists. This is city of Dubrovnik, this is the cruiser. In Dubrovnik now you have altogether 800 inhabitants. At the cruiser you have 2,000 or 3,000, so you can imagine. And this is the heat map of geotagged photo of the city of Dubrovnik. So these are the city walls, and this is the main pedestrian street. So all these images are obviously taken by these tourists who come with the cruise ships and then take selfies or whatsoever. There is no local life here anymore. And then, last image, Boris Groys spoke about this concept or phenomenon of double erasure. First, Stalinist erasure of previous times, and then this post-socialist erasure, which erased culture of modernist socialism. Here you can see a Hotel Lone, designed by 3LHD architects in 2006, just next to the Hotel Eden near Rovinj, built in late 60s, early 70s. You see the continuation of modern ideas. You see the continuation of technologies, how Boris Groys would define this way towards the utopia, but nevertheless, despite the fact that we learned something from the modernization processes during the socialism, nowadays we are facing new problems. We are not living in a self-managed socialism anymore. We have to deal with neoliberal economy, and the question is how much this idyllic image is going to stay like it is here. Thank you. And sorry for 5 more minutes.